Friends, I greet all of you. I'm glad to see you all. And we are at a very important point together. The whole week has been dedicated to the so-called lesson. Let me tell you exactly what it's called: Christianity and Rome. I specifically took these 2 weeks to give you, so to speak, the main foundation, and then we'll go even further. We studied together, we discussed this topic. The first Roman perspective on Christians. Why were they called atheists? Why, in fact, were they disliked? Why were they actually suspected of conspiracies and all sorts of other things? Today, we'll delve deeper into this historical background and talk in more detail about Emperor Nero himself and about the persecutions and the suffering that the first Christians endured. In other words, let's say, this is the second generation. Today, I think Christians wouldn't go for that, of course. They would simply accept the Roman terms, merge with the state, basically trading their beliefs for government money or privileges. That's basically what always happened later on. But in those times, back then, Christianity was just beginning to take shape and was, in fact, not much different from Judaism. Even in the Roman provinces, they were confused with synagogues and Jews because they believed in the one Creator. They revered the same sacred scriptures together with the Jews. So that's why they were often simply mistaken for them. Now, today we're going to talk about this. We'll talk about why Christians rejected paganism, but did not reject the Torah itself. This is very important. And also, this week we'll finish our course with the topic, the cult of saints, from remembrance to deification. These things will also be important for us. And only next week will we move on to the Jewish line and continue studying the history of Israel. So, from the last lesson, we understood and actually saw how the followers of Yeshua looked in the eyes of the Romans. This first impression was full of fear, contempt, and misunderstanding. They were accused of atheism, cannibalism, and other foreign things. In other words, they were seen as outsiders, enemies of the state. Those who did not submit to the emperor did not offer sacrifices to him and did not make offerings to the Roman gods. This is actually a truly terrifying thing, which in principle laid the groundwork for violence. Today, we'll take another step forward and we'll look, in fact, from the theory of those things that happened to the practice of how it all ended. This is one of the dark turns in human history, not the darkest, but one of them. So, we're going to talk about the reign of Emperor Nero, since these were the first official persecutions of Christians. And in fact, if we read Revelation impartially, we see it describes this, and also Emperor Nero and Caesar, the collective embodiment of emperors. So, the topic of our lesson today is Nero and his persecutions. So, what exactly happened? We'll break it down in detail in this lesson. Who was this person? What kind of Rome did this man actually rule? How did all these executions take place? And most importantly, how did Rome itself perceive these victims? Were they only for Christians? And were they really only Christian victims at all? Or were they part of the larger, mysterious Jewish world? And we should remember that during the reign of Emperor Caligula, the Jewish community was expelled from Rome. And before that, Emperor Nero simply destroyed Christians. All these things are very interesting, and they lead us to a fascinating thought. that in fact the first Christians, just like the first Jews, were heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire. And they certainly didn't feel any great love for that monster called Rome. But to understand all the events of the year 64, we first need to understand the world in which they took place. Notice that Rome in the middle of the first century is not just a capital city. Rome in the mid-first century is a melting pot of the entire world. It's a gigantic metropolis where luxury exists side by side with extreme poverty, and faith in the ancient gods coexists with dozens, even thousands, of Eastern cults. Rome was not homogeneous. It was home to a huge number of people, an enormous number of people from all nations. Everyone came with their own beliefs and their own gods. But the Roman gods were above all of them. So who was Nero? Nero ascended to the throne at a very young age. His reign can be divided into two periods. The first years were relatively calm. Why? Because he was a child under the influence of his mentors. But then his true nature began to show. He was a man of incredible vanity and artistic ambition. In other words, he was, a real theater lover. He had a truly paranoid cruelty. He killed his mother, his wife, and forced senators to sit through his hours-long theatrical performances, which were talentless. For him, all of Rome was a stage, and he was the main actor. Every day, he had to win the attention of the entire Senate. God forbid that anyone else should be more important than him. He was an absolute narcissist, incredibly and extremely bloodthirsty. I don't know if you can imagine the city of Rome. Even today, those who come to Rome are amazed by its scale. For that time, it was something absolutely incredible. But still, there were narrow, chaotically built streets, multi-story insulae. That is, apartment buildings where the poor lived in cramped conditions, right next to luxurious palaces, temples, and baths. Something was always happening in this city. There was movement around the clock. Triumphal processions, gladiatorial games, religious festivals. This city didn't sleep for a single second. There was also a large Jewish community living in this city. They had their own distinct part of the city, their very own bustling markets, their own specialized shops, and their own kosher dedicated workshops. It was actually a closed Jewish community. And within this community, or next to it, there was a growing community of Christian followers, that is, followers of Yeshua. At first, the Romans simply confused them with the Jews. They didn't really delve too deeply into Jewish practices. They simply understood that Christians also gathered together and honored the same Jewish God. That's it. They revered the Jewish Messiah and didn't participate in Roman festivals. And just like the Jews, they were surrounded by all sorts of rumors. They also revered the Jewish scriptures. For the authorities, Judaism was an ancient religion. It was a permitted religion, that is, the so-called religio licita, because the coexistence of Judaism and Rome went back a very long way. The cohabitation of these communities, these two paths, was very ancient, and the Romans had already gotten used to it. And the Romans, they respected antiquity. Jews were actually allowed not to honor the Roman gods. But the new group, they were not Jews. And this group caused confusion. They kind of came out of the Jews, revered their scriptures. But unlike the Jews who did not attract Gentiles, these people actively welcomed everyone into their ranks. Moreover, they worshipped a certain Jew who had been crucified, executed by the Romans on a cross like a criminal. For the Romans, this was an even more baffling phenomenon. To the average Roman, the difference wasn't clear at all. Both groups were seen as followers of an Eastern superstition. The Jews were consistent in their superstitions, and these others were followers of their own superstitions. But both refused to worship the gods of the empire and lived in closed communities. It was precisely this otherness, this sense of being different and foreign, that made them an easy target. In fact, this same otherness has followed the Jews throughout the ages. Later on, Christians were no longer the outsiders. They had become the rulers of the world. But the Jews remained different, and that's why they continued to face persecution and extermination. Although in reality, from the very beginning, they were actually on the same side. You see how history shifts all priorities depending on who rises and who falls. It's really important to realize this, and we'll keep coming back to it. And so, in July of the year 64 AD, this overcrowded and tense city bursts into flames, and to such an extent, the Great Fire of Rome raged for 6 days and 7 nights. Back then, everything was built out of wood. Even the buildings made of stone still had wooden interiors. And the fire itself destroyed a huge part of the city. Panic and anger swept through the entire population of Rome. Rome was literally burning. In the blink of an eye, rumors began to spread that the emperor himself was to blame. People said that Nero just wanted to clear space for his new grand palace, the so-called Golden House. He even watched the flames and played the lyre. That's how he contemplated the fire. In other words, he saw it all, like a theatrical performance. But Nero urgently needed to find someone to blame in order to save his reputation. And here, of course, his gaze fell on the perfect candidates. These were, of course, the Christians. And as we already learned from the previous lesson, they were hated for their abominations and considered enemies of the human race. They were outsiders who could easily be blamed for anything. They were accused of cabal, of cannibalism, of drinking the blood of children. In the future, Jews would be accused of this as well. So Tacitus explains to us who was a witness to all these events and, generally speaking, did not have much sympathy for the people or for the Christians either, which makes his testimony all the more valuable. So he writes, "And so Nero, in order to put an end to the rumors, sought out the guilty and subjected to the most exquisite tortures those who, by their abominations, had drawn upon themselves the general hatred and whom the crowd called Christians. This was, in actual fact, the very first official persecution in all of history, which was directly initiated by the emperor himself. Nero didn't just execute them, he turned it into a sadistic show. After all, he turned everything into a show. He turned this into a show as well. Now you understand what a terrifying world people lived in. And when you say, "Oh, what a terrible time, the end times, how frightening it is to live in this world now," my friends, today we are living in paradise. Not only are we living in a good world, today we are truly living in real paradise. You couldn't even imagine in your dreams how people used to live. You can't even picture it. So, Tacitus describes for us 3 specific types of executions that Nero staged in his gardens. Let's take a closer look at them before you start sighing about these terrible end times. Oh no, now we have chips in our brains. My friends, these are just minor things in life, really. So, people were thrown to be torn apart by wild animals. This was, in fact, the most common execution in the arena. They would catch wild animals, feed them meat, keep them hungry, and then bring out people, sew them into the skins of wild animals, and set hungry dogs, lions, tigers, and panthers on them, who would simply tear them to pieces. The whole arena roared. It was, of course, a terrible horror, but the whole arena roared, some out of joy, some out of terror. And most importantly, it was all about creating an impression. Creating the impression of bread and circuses. It was important to impress people, to instill the right emotional responses in them, to guide them properly, to keep them in a certain state of fear. Crucifixion was the most shameful execution, reserved for slaves and rebels. For the followers of Yeshua, those who understood that Yeshua was crucified, this execution did not have a particularly tragic meaning. But the living torches, that was the most monstrous invention. People, both men and women, were tied to posts. Their bodies were smeared with tar and flammable substances, and they were set on fire before nightfall. And they served as torches, illuminating the nighttime festivities in the emperor's gardens. It's impossible to even imagine something like that happening today. That's why even today, the most sophisticated dictatorial or any kind of regimes can't stoop to that level. They come close, but they're not capable of it. Who were these people? They were the Roman community. These were the very people to whom Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. And according to some traditions, again, these are church traditions, among those victims were the apostles Peter and Paul. Again, these are church traditions. We don't have historical evidence for this. Caspers, thank you. We don't have historical evidence. These are church traditions that Peter and Paul were also there, killed in that same arena. And Tacitus writes that despite the Christians' guilt and superstition, these cruel executions even aroused compassion. They did arouse it. People understood that they were being killed not for the sake of justice, but to satisfy the emperor's bloodthirstiness. Nero executed them deliberately executed them. Tacitus speaks clearly about Christians, But we must understand the whole context in order to understand why both Jews and Christians suffered together. For example, Joseph Levi, the Jewish Roman historian, for example, who describes in detail the reign of Nero, does not mention the persecution of Christians at all. That is, some scholars believe that he might have seen this entirely as an internal affair of Rome, which, generally speaking, did not concern the Jews overall. Others think that he did not describe the sufferings of the Christians because, in his worldview, he included them in the general picture of the sufferings of the Jewish people, without distinguishing Christians as a separate group at all. So even Josephus Flavius did not single out Christians as a separate group. He saw them as part of the Jewish community, which was subjected to terrible persecution. Hatred toward Christians didn't just appear out of nowhere. It didn't come from thin air. It grew out of the already existing everyday anti-Semitism in Rome. Note that this is the year 1964. In 1964, the siege of Jerusalem is about to begin. And then the burning of the Jerusalem temple. This is happening right at that time. Everyday anti-Semitism also existed in Rome back then. Jews were known for having strange customs. They observed the Sabbath so strictly that they would even stop working and wouldn't even make their servants work. And their slaves also didn't work. Even the livestock rested, which made the Romans mock them, and that's why they called them the circumcised. And we read in the New Testament many times, the circumcised who came with Peter. And these circumcised, my friends, when I read these words, they grate on my ears. Why? Because nowhere in Talmudic literature, in Jewish literature, do Jews call other Jews the circumcised. This is purely a Roman expression which proves to us that all these texts were very thoroughly edited. In fact, Jews never used such words. Not in a single document we have in our possession. Not in early literature, not in later literature, Jews never called Dub-Dug the circumcised. That is, it was considered an insult. And these insults were mentioned by the Romans in relation to the Jews, because they considered all these things strange. The things that Jews did with their children and with each other were seen as a harsh and cruel form of bodily mutilation. In fact, outside the Jewish community, circumcision was completely forbidden, as it was considered bodily harm. That's why Paul, even if he wanted to, could not circumcise non-Jews, because by doing so he would be breaking Roman law. That is, before the Council of Nicaea. Especially in the first century, Rome really saw Christians as a specific Jewish sect. So, although Nero formally accused Christians, it's quite possible that among the Christians there were those whom we could confidently call Jews today. In the same way they were arrested, and in the same way they were sentenced. In any case, Nero's persecutions became a difficulty, grew into a terrible tragedy. And yet, what Nero did happened literally just a few years later. The siege of Jerusalem and the burning of the Jerusalem temple. That is, Rome, as a power, was destroying both Jews and Christians at the same time, until the status of Christians changed. And we will look at that. In any case, Nero's persecutions became a terrible tragedy that struck the group. A group that hadn't even fully separated from its Jewish roots yet. They still considered themselves monotheists, continued to follow the sacred Jewish texts, and observed the commandments. If there were Nazarenes among them, then the Nazarenes were Jews through and through. In any case, Nero wanted to destroy the pernicious superstition, but he achieved the exact opposite effect, because it was precisely in the fire of persecution that the phenomenon of Christian martyrdom was born. The Greek word martyros, which means witness. Now then, thus, by their deaths, these people bore witness to their faith. Today, it's unimaginable to even think about this, because today's Christianity is simply incapable of it. In any form. Today we love comfort, Really, is that so? God forbid someone violates your rights. God forbid that someone should tell us what to do. The steadfastness of those martyrs in the face of unimaginable suffering became a powerful sermon. In fact, it wasn't a defeat, it was a victory. As Tertullian would later say, the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. That's why Nero gave the church its first and most revered heroes, whom we will also talk about together. So this lesson that we're discussing today showed the young community that faith in Yeshua is not just philosophical reflection. It's not a doctrinal choice. It's a path that may require you to give up everything, including your own life. Now, what made these people who they were? That's the question we'll be exploring together. Why were they ready to make such a sacrifice? But it is precisely this willingness to sacrifice that will become one of the reasons why Christianity will not only survive, but ultimately conquer the Roman Empire itself. And this leads us to think about why suffering, pain, torment, spilled blood, and the agony of martyrs always becomes a springboard for heroism. The same thing that happened in the Holocaust. The state of Israel was created practically from scratch, on the bones. So what is important to understand in our study? And the next lesson we do will shed even more light. Sveta, about who they were. Why they rejected paganism but did not reject the Torah. After all, they could accept it if they rejected the Torah. And the Torah, for example, was no longer for them. The sacred word of God, and this was indeed the Old Testament, so why wouldn't they compromise, which is precisely what eventually happened in the following centuries, leading to significant historical developments. That is, if the barriers of what is allowed and not allowed, right and wrong, if that barrier doesn't exist. If, for example, the Ten Commandments have no meaning, and if the Torah is the Old Testament, and the commandment "do not make for yourself other gods" specifically refers to the Old Testament, then it's possible to compromise with other gods because there's no problem. But why did these people go to their deaths and yet still obeyed the commandment of monotheism? Yes, you shall have no other gods before me. And why did they not accept the Roman gods, refused to accept them, and chose only the God of Israel? This brings us to a very important insight about these early people, something that was missing in the centuries that followed. Why in the later centuries? For example, it was easy to replace the Sabbath with the day of the sun, Sunday. Or why, instead of Hanukkah, they established the birthday of the god Mithras, who was born on December 25th. And no one had any problem with this. But why did these first Christians of the second generation couldn't even consider such a thing? What made them remain faithful to the Torah and its commandments, and even go to their deaths accepting martyrdom rather than compromise? These are interesting things that we will talk about together. Very interesting things. Today, none of us have any issues with this. Yeah, no problem. We'll celebrate every holiday we can. After all, they're just holidays. We'll drag a Christmas tree into our place, into the house of God, set this up, set that up. Yeah, absolutely no problem. We are saved by grace. If the first Christians had thought this way, yeah, they wouldn't have suffered. They would have said, hey, wait a minute. We're just as Roman as you are. We're all good. Everything's fine with us. No problems at all. But we see that this didn't happen. We see that those first Christians were different. And why were they different while those who came after them were not? Why did later generations take up icon painting and all sorts of other things while those Christians were not like that? What made them who they were? Why was it for them better to die rather than bow down to the Roman gods? Yeah, today that's not a problem at all. State holidays, some kind of celebration in the name of something or other, it's not a problem at all. If it gets us favor with the state or serves some interests, yeah, we have no problem at all. We're ready for anything. Why can we never be like them? How did Christianity change? Why did it lose its core? It was those very first Christians who gave their lives for the one Creator. If they had believed in polytheism, that there are many gods, then what would be the problem? Is it really worth giving your life and facing terrible executions for that? Sure, no problem, we have 3 gods, but there could be a 4th or a 5th. What's the issue, really? So why didn't those people do that? This is a very important question, and very few people actually think about it. Who were Christians really before Nicaea? And what kind of Christians did the Creator actually want to see among the nations? Who are they? This is the group that was supposed to become part of the house of Israel. But due to many circumstances, both historical and spiritual, they couldn't enter into this, and why what didn't work out back then might work out today. And why we live in an amazing time when we are called to fix what the first Christians couldn't do. Not the first ones, but the second generation we're talking about. Those first ones were Jews like Peter, Paul, James. There's no question about them. Why do we have to correct this? And why did the Creator give us these times? Why did He bring us to such times when no one burns you at the stake for your beliefs, doesn't flay you alive or turn you into a living torch, when today you have freedom of speech? But even with this freedom, we still choose slavery. All these and other things, my friends, we will talk about with you in future broadcasts. So stay tuned for my announcements. Tomorrow we will continue, as I already told you, we will continue with this topic. Specifically, why Christians rejected paganism but did not reject the Torah. We will understand this in the end. And on Friday, Be'ezrat Hashem, if all goes well, we will finish this week by understanding the cult of the saints. How easy it really is to go from remembrance to deification. And only next week will we continue with Jewish history and keep moving forward toward the Bar Kokhba revolt. So you don't miss anything I say, my friends, you need to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the like button and the bell. There's nothing difficult about it. I ask you to hit the bell, just like in kindergarten. Donations to the Beit Midrash are also welcome. My friends, we are living in a wonderful, beautiful time today, a time when everything is changing. We are living in an amazing era of opportunities that never existed before today. And we have no right to miss out on these times. We must make every effort in order to understand the time we live in and to run our own race. I bless you from the land of Israel, wish you all blessings, and I'll see you tomorrow. Shalom to everyone.